Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to the Coal Iron channel. My name is Logan. I'm one of the development team members here at Coal Iron, and today we're gonna go through unboxing and installing the digital press controller on a press that you might already have in your shop. So let's just dive straight into it. In these boxes here, I have the Coal Iron digital press controller and the box of accessories and mounting hardware. So when you receive your kit in to install on your press, it'll come in two boxes, and the square box is the one that has the actual controller in it. We're gonna set that aside for now and dive into the mount hardware just to show you guys kind of what we've got going on and how everything is organized. I'm gonna go ahead and open this box here. And the first thing I'm going to pull out is our hardware kit. And I'm gonna set that aside for now. Get some of these Instapacks out of the way. Next is going to be a small cardboard box that has the digital encoder for the press in it. So that's very, very important. We're gonna set that in a safe spot for now. We've got our power cord for the unit. We've got the remote foot pedal and the 10-foot lead for it. And then we have our mag switch joystick box here. Under the rest of these Instapacks here is the mount plate for the controller itself on the press and the solenoid valve that actually allows the controller to work. So this valve is already plumbed together. We'll just need to unplumb the existing valve on the press and add the new pressure and return lines as well as the two work ports, and then get it mounted up and it'll be good to go. So we'll set that aside for now as well. And lastly, we have the 1/4-inch plate, mount plate for the controller itself. And that is everything in that accessories box. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. In the actual digital press controller box, like I mentioned earlier, we have the actual controller itself, very safely packed. And I'm actually gonna leave this in the box once I get these Instapacks out of the way, because we won't be ready for it until the mount plate is installed on the press. So next, we're going to take a look at an existing valve on a 25-ton here and go through what it looks like to pull that existing valve off, hopefully not make a huge mess with all the hydraulic oil, and then get the new mount plate installed. So on this 25-ton, we have a chief valve. This might look different than your valve. We very recently switched to using these on the 25-ton, or actually on all of our presses, but no worries if it's different from your valve. Everything's got to come off anyway, so I'll just go through how to do that. So I do have a couple of tools lined up here that'll make things a lot easier, this whole process a lot easier. I've got a 1-inch crescent wrench, a 22-millimeter crescent wrench. Obviously, if you have two adjustables, that will work as well. I've got a 3/8, a 5/16, a 3/16, and a 1/4-inch hex driver socket here. You could also use a regular set of Allen keys. I'm just gonna use the impact with the hex drivers there because it'll make the process go a little bit faster. First things first, I'm going to want to unplumb our two work ports for our hydraulic cylinder here. Now you're gonna wanna have some kind of cup on standby because those lines are gonna have some hydraulic oil in them, and maybe a rag or two is gonna be necessary as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab my 1-inch and my 22-millimeter crescent wrenches, and I'm going to unplumb the fittings here at the work ports. So you have a 90-degree elbow here into a straight fitting with a swivel connection. And so at that swivel is where I'm gonna disconnect them, with the 1-inch going on the swivel and the 22 going on the hose itself. And I'm going to break the seal here, focusing on turning the swivel, not the hose itself, because obviously the hose is going to be kind of bound up as it's still connected to the cylinder. So once you break that seal loose and give it a couple of turns, you should be able to turn the swivel by hand. I'm going to ditch this wrench as well and get my cup on standby here, and just loosen up that hose and drain as much oil out of it as I can. I do have on my workbench over here a few zip ties on standby, and once you get most of the oil drained out of these hoses, you can zip tie them up around the lifting hole or somewhere else on your press just to keep them from dribbling oil all over the place. So once that guy is mostly drained out, we're gonna go ahead and grab a zip tie here and spill them all over the floor. I'm just gonna bend this guy up out of the way, let gravity do some work for me here. So I'm gonna do the same thing again on the other work port. Depending on the cylinder position, one of these hoses is going to be, or sorry, depending on the position your slide is in, one of these hoses is gonna be more full than the other. And you just kind of gotta work your way through some of that oil. Fortunately, this is the messiest part of the process. It should all be downhill from there. Let that guy drain out a little bit more. Cool, so now that those guys are buttoned up, next we are going to undo our pressure hose here, going into the valve. So I'm going to use the same wrench to undo this swivel as well. And if you loosen the fitting just enough that it's still held in place, you'll actually hear the oil kind of drain back down to the tank since it's no longer under pressure. And you should be able to get pretty minimal drip out of this 90. The hose is going to be very full, so I'm going to just quickly turn it over and get some of it poured out just so I can bundle this hose up as well and get it safely out of the way. All right, so I've got our work hoses here bundled up at the top of the press. I've got our pressure hose disconnected, drained a little bit, and tucked safely out of the way. One tool that I forgot to mention earlier is a 1/4 inch hex driver for the impact or drill or whatever you may have. You can use a flathead screwdriver as well, but sometimes these hose clamps are on there pretty tight, so this is a very handy tool to use. So I'm going to go ahead and undo this hose clamp from the return line hose, and these hose barbs sometimes can be really stuck on there, so hopefully we won't have to fight this one too much to come off. Yep, that one was not too bad. So you might have to wrestle with that for a little while. Sometimes you can cut a very little slit at the top of the hose to get some wiggle room to get that around the hose barbs. But if you do that, you'll want to trim your return line hose just a little bit shorter to get rid of any cuts you might have in the side of the hose. So now that we've got all of our hoses unplumbed, I've got the return and pressure hose just kind of hanging here, but they've been drained out, so hopefully they're not making too much of a mess. Now it's time to actually remove the valve from the press. So I am going to grab a 3/16 hex, whether it's an Allen wrench or a driver for a drill. And if you have an old style valve that's a little bit bigger than this, there should be 3 bolts that will just come off. I'm not sure off the top of my head what kind of fastener those were used to attach, but you can pull that off. If you have one of the newer Chief valves on the press, you'll pull these 2 socket head cap screws with a 3/16 bit, and then also remove the adapter plate that's sitting behind that valve. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these guys off. And be sure not to spill too much fluid. There will still be some left in that valve. I'm going to swap over to a 3/8 hex driver here, undo these bolts for the adapter plate. And the press is free of its valve. So now we can dive into mounting the controller adapter plate and fixture to the press itself. So now that we are ready to start mounting the actual controller to the press, we'll go over the hardware kit that came with the controller kit real quick. and show how the plate attaches to the press and the controller attaches to the plate. So first in the bag, we have a bolster plate here with two 5/8 threaded holes in it. This is for the through bolts that will mount through the hole that your valve handle used to pass through. We have two countersunk bolts to go along with that here for the 5/8. We have four 3/8/16 socket head cap screws for the valve to mount to the mount plate itself. And then we have a handful of 1/4-20s as well. So there are two different lengths of 1/4-20. One is a 3/4 inch and one is a 1/2 inch. We're gonna start with three 1/2 inch 1/4-20 bolts here and the 1/4 inch hex driver in our drill. And we're gonna use that to initially mount the plate to the frame of the press. So I've got our 1/2 inch 1/4-20s queued up on the drill driver right here. And I'm gonna grab our mount plate with the bend in the plate facing the operator side. So you want this little mount flange to be facing you. And for your three holes here for the 1/4-20s to be lined up to the mount where the valve used to mount to the press. So I'm going to hold that plate there, grab my 1/4-20 and drive that in. I'm not gonna tighten it all the way so that I can get my other three bolts to align. So now that the bracket is held in place by those 1/4-20s, I'm gonna grab the 3/8 hex driver, our two flathead 5/8 bolts, and our bolster plate. And I am going to feed the flatheads through the countersunk holes in the plate and thread them into the bolster plate on the front side of the press. Just get those started. And then I'm not going to tighten these all the way. I'm going to kind of alternate between the two so that they seat in their countersinks. And go back and tighten the first one. And that's going to be plenty solid for our needs. So next up, we have the four holes here that are the 3/8/16 for the actual valve stack itself. So I'm going to swap over to the 5/16 hex. I'm going to grab my four 3/8/16 socket head cap screws and the solenoid valve stack itself. So one thing we forgot to mention earlier is on the solenoid stack itself, these two fittings going straight up and then this 90 up are our two work ports. And this fitting's kind of hard to reach once it's actually on the press. So I am actually going to go ahead and on our top cylinder hose here, I'm gonna actually remove this entirely and let it drain out. And we'll install that hose on the solenoid valve before we put it on the press. And that way we can just reconnect it to the cylinder once it's on the press, and that'll be a lot easier. So once that hose is drained, on the top work port here of the solenoid valve, I'm going to go ahead and take the fitting cap out of it and thread in our work port hose. Grab our wrenches. Make sure that this is tightened down nice and tight. These swivel fittings do have an O-ring in them, which helps with the seal. But I want to make sure that we're not going to be leaking. All right, so now that that work port hose is plumbed to the valve, we can go back to our socket head cap screws with our 5/16 hex driver and actually install the solenoid on the press. So the best way that I've found to do this is to kind of hold it close to your chest here, throw one bolt in there, and get your driver kind of seated and ready to go, and just throw everything onto the press at once. Guide that bolt into the first hole and drive that in, and that will be enough to hold it into place while we can get our other 4 bolts squared away. Alrighty, so we have our solenoid mounted to the press. Notice that the connector cable is coming out the bottom and the pressure gauge is coming out the top. I'm going to grab our other work port hose and remove the fitting cap of the A port on our solenoid base plate. Pull our other work port hose down from up top, and be careful to watch out for any residual oil that might flow from bending this guy back down, but shouldn't be too bad. And I'm going to start tightening that swivel fitting. Just get that hand tight for now, and then we'll circle back. I'm going to take our work port that we previously pulled off the cylinder and just reconnect it. Again, just getting it started and getting it hand tight for now. And take a moment to double check that the fitting coming straight out the top that's labeled B on the solenoid is going to the top of your cylinder, and that the A port is going to the bottom port in your cylinder. So I'm going to get that hand tight as well. And then I'll take our pressure hose from down below and remove the fitting that is underneath the pressure gauge over here at the P port on the other side of the relief valve here. Pull that lid, and again, get that hand tight. And the reason I'm getting these all hand tight is I'm just going to go back through with the wrenches once they're all set up and tighten them all at once. So now that those 3 fittings are in place, we will go ahead and tighten them up. In this case, now that the hoses are actually in place, you want to turn on the swivel fittings and just use the smaller wrench to hold the hoses straight. That way you're not twisting the hose in a weird way and getting it bound up. You want a nice smooth arc from the port to where it's going. All right, so now that those are all nice and tight, the last thing we need to do from a plumbing perspective is to reattach our low pressure return hose. Now, you want to be careful, depending on your press model, your return port might be sitting significantly lower. Do not cram the hose back down into the base, because that will cause a kink in the base and cause the hose to leak or come undone from one of the fittings. This hose is very easy to trim with just a regular old box knife. So I'm going to go ahead and trim down about 6 inches off the length of this hose so that we can install it on the new port. So in order to do that, a pipe cutter works really nicely if you have one laying around, but a box knife can do the trick as well. So I am going to roll this sleeve down. It's a lot easier to do when it's not covered in hydraulic oil. Just eyeball. There's some flexibility in the length here of the hose. You just don't want to cram it down into the base too far. So roughly, in this case, on this 25 ton, about 7 inches is coming off. So I'm just going to pierce that hose and then follow it in a circle. So once you have the hose trimmed down to length, we're just going to plumb back up onto the hose barb here using the same hex driver. This is a 8mm or a 1/4 inch would also work hex driver. we'll tighten the hose clamp down around the hose barb. And now our plumbing is finished on the controller. So now this is ready to go. From that perspective, it's time to start actually attaching the controller and some of the peripherals for it, and then we'll be ready to fire the press up and get to work. All right, so now that the solenoid is mounted in place, next up we're going to install the encoder on the press. So the encoder is actually what's going to tell the controller where the slide assembly is in its travel window, and it'll help us do modes like the auto mode and also have accurate set points so that the press knows where to stop. So the encoder has a string kind of slide assembly here with a really strong magnet on it, and then 2 M5 screws in the top. So I'm going to take a 3mm Allen wrench here, pull these M5 screws out of the top, and on this 90-degree flange right here, there's a slot cut in the top. I'm going to drop the M5 screw through that slot and thread into those holes. And I'm trying to center the magnet over the back portion of our slide assembly right here. If you have an older press with the bronze assemblies, we will ship this encoder with a adhesive attachment method to attach the bronze, or if you have the upgraded retrofit kit for the slide assembly, it'll just stick straight to it. So I'm going to install both M5 screws here. Centering this post over the slide. Make sure those are nice and tight. Then I'm going to lower the magnet here and attach it to the slide assembly. Now, once you actually have everything up and running, you'll want to go back and ensure that throughout the travel window that this magnet is sitting directly below this post, and so that the string is dead straight, both looking at it from the front as well as the side, so that there's no angles in the string as it's traveling. That'll make sure that this encoder lasts the lifetime of the press. I'm going to pop this zip tie here real quick. And I like to feed our encoder cable back behind these work ports hoses, behind the solenoid, so that it doesn't get snagged on anything, and we'll just hang that there for now until we are ready to plug it into the controller. So now that our encoder is installed, we will spin the press around and install the actual controller on the mount, and then plug our fittings in, and we'll be off to the races. So let's go ahead and spin that around and get rolling on that. All right, so now it's time to actually install the controller itself on the press. So I already showed you opening up that box, but one thing I want to point out is on the back of the controller enclosure is 4 mount holes that we actually have to access from the inside of the enclosure. So you can take a flathead screwdriver or a pry bar or a coin or whatever you might have handy to undo the latch here, open that up and see what goes on inside the controller here. These 4 mount holes are a little bit harder to access, so having a driver with an extended reach is really handy, but I'm going to feed one of my 3/4 inch quarter 20 bolts with a washer on it through the controller box, through that hole, kind of holding everything carefully. And then I'm going to line it up to one of our mount holes here and get it started. Again, I'm not going to tighten this all the way so that we still have some wiggle room to mount the rest of our screws. But it's kind of a sketchy process if you're doing it by yourself. If you have someone else in the shop to help you, it's definitely not a bad thing. But I'm just holding the controller steady, feeding another bolt and washer onto my driver here, and feeding everything through. The holes in the mount plate itself are tapped for the quarter 20. And then we have provided some jam nuts as well to go on the back side of the mount plate, just to ensure that everything is nice and tight and won't come undone due to the vibration of the press. Now that all 4 bolts are in place, I'm going to go back through and tighten them up. And I'm going to grab my remaining 4 washers and nuts, just to use as a jam nut on the threads that are sticking out on the back side of the bracket here, and get those locked into place. Alrighty, so now that that's all buttoned up, we are ready to get things plugged in, and we'll be forging in no time. So I'm going to shut this guy again. And next up, we're gonna grab the foot pedal and the joystick and the power cable, and we'll get everything plugged in, and we'll be ready to go. Okay, so now it's time to install our cables, and then we'll be done with our installation. So first up, we have our C14 power cable here. Now, this may look like a standard computer cable that you've used in the past. The only difference is this little red tab here on the inside of the plug that goes into the actual controller. It's a little locking tab. Because this hangs vertically, we wanted to make sure that wasn't going to get pulled out by accident. Other than that, everything is normal. It's just if you ever go to remove the power cable, make sure to hit that tab with your thumb so that you can remove it from the port. So I'll undo that twist tie there. Install that guy straight into the port pretty easily. Next up, we have our connector from our encoder. This connector is keyed 5-pin, so you'll see a little indexing tab at the top of the connector, and that will line up with the corresponding tab on the port in the controller, and then that will just thread into place. Just finger tight is fine. These don't need to be torqued down at all. Next up, we have the same connector, or a larger version of the connector on the valve mount. And the bottom side of the enclosure, there are labels for all of these connector ports. So this is the solenoid valve. That's only a 4-pin connector. That's going to go in next. Again, lining up that tabbed key and threading that onto the port. And we're good to go there. And the final 2 ports are both labeled remote control. That's referring to either the joystick or the foot pedal. You can install either one in either port. It's not going to make a difference. So I'll grab our foot pedal with our 10-foot lead here. Plug that guy into the next port. And lastly, our mag switch joystick. So the way that this guy works is we have a switchable magnet here. So in the on position with a little locking mechanism, that will stick to the press nice and securely. And then to release it, just pull the latch on the back side of the magnet and flip that back over and off, and it'll come right off. This will allow you to move the joystick wherever you might need to, especially if you're working out on the end of the C-frame of the press. Relocating that control is really a really nice feature to have. So all that's left to do is install that joystick connector in that final port on the bottom of the controller. And the install of the digital press controller on this 25-ton is finished. So we get that this is kind of an involved process. This isn't your standard everyday maintenance that you might see on your forge press, having to unplumb that valve and get everything squared away. So if you have any questions or concerns whatsoever, please don't hesitate to give us a call or reach out to us at service@coleiron.com. More than happy to consult on getting you through this installation process and on into forging. So guys, I hope that this was helpful. We have an actual overview of the menu system in the controller, how to set all the set points, go through the different modes, and how everything works in a separate video. We'll link that in the description down below, so be on the lookout for that. But other than that, guys, that is all I have for you today. So thank you so much for watching, and happy precise forging. We'll see you on the next one.